Hello friends, I am glad to see you again. Today I'm going to tell you about a neighbor who demands the keys to my garage. I've always taken pride in keeping my private life separate from the hum of everyday neighborhood drama. But a few months back, everything changed after I separated from my husband and chose to remain in the house we'd bought together. Not many people around me knew the full story, and to be honest, I wasn't eager to share it. The pain was still raw, and I was just trying to navigate a new phase of life. One where my evenings were a little quieter and my mornings felt a bit more daunting. Yet here I am now, writing down something I never thought I'd experience. Someone demanding access to my own garage simply because they assumed I no longer needed it. I'm an ordinary person living in a small suburban area, about a half-hour drive from the nearest big city. The house itself was a simple split level with a backyard that ended in a few tall trees, giving me just the right amount of shade during summer. The garage was detached, built on a foundation next to the house, and connected by a short concrete path. Before my husband left, we both used the space for our vehicles, storing gardening tools and occasionally stashing boxes of old memories we were not quite ready to part with. After our separation, I continued living there alone. Well, not entirely alone. I had my cat, Pebbles, who took over the entire basement whenever she could. The reason for our breakup wasn't dramatic in the conventional sense. No catastrophic betrayal, no fireworks. But it was still heartbreaking. We simply realized we'd grown apart over the years, becoming two entirely different people with dissimilar goals. It wasn't anyone's fault in the typical sense, but the emotional toll was heavy on me. Friends tried to comfort me by saying it was better to move on than to remain stuck in an unfulfilling relationship. They were right, though it didn't stop my heart from aching. I was just trying to get through each day, dealing with the bittersweet process of rediscovering who I was outside of a marriage. I didn't expect my next big hurdle to involve a neighbor who saw fit to weigh in on my marital status and personal property. Her name was Marisol, and she lived 2 houses down. Marisol had a relentless energy about her. People said she was friendly enough but also extremely pushy when she wanted something. She'd been renting a single room in the house next door for nearly a year, sharing it with several other tenants. The homeowner, as far as I knew, was frequently away on business and rented out parts of the property as a way to cover costs. The homeowner also had a separate garage on his lot, but it was smaller and had additional fees, so Marisol ended up parking in the driveway, paying monthly for that privilege. I'd only had casual greetings with Marisol before. We'd wave when I'd see her taking out the trash or stepping out of her car, and once we briefly chatted about how unruly the local raccoons were. Nothing substantial. That changed abruptly one Saturday morning about 6 months after my husband moved out. I was in the middle of pruning the bushes along the front yard fence when she marched up to me with a determined look. I greeted her politely, but she wasted no time getting straight to the point. "You're not using your garage anymore, right? Since your husband left, you're the only one living here. So how about you let me keep my car in there?" Her tone was more of a directive than a request. I found myself momentarily speechless, holding my pruning shears while blinking at her in confusion. "I'm sorry, what?" I asked, trying to ensure I'd heard her correctly. She then proceeded to explain that because of her living arrangement, she had to pay rent for the driveway space, and that it was unfair. According to her, I no longer needed a garage if I wasn't storing 2 cars anymore. She reasoned out loud that this was an obvious solution for everyone. She'd have free or very cheap parking, and I would just be nice. I was stunned, though I tried to remain polite. "I'm still using my garage," I told her. "It's my property, and I like to keep my car in there. Also, there are things stored inside that aren't easy to move. It's not something I'd be comfortable just handing over." I'd hoped that would be the end of it. Straightforward, no room for discussion. But that was my first mistake, assuming Marisol would accept a polite dismissal. She pressed on, insisting that since I was single now, I didn't have to worry about sharing space. She told me I should do something generous for a neighbor. It was baffling. I'd never had anyone claim that a separated person automatically had no need for certain amenities. I tried not to let her see how irritated I was, but my voice must have faltered because she changed tactics. She began praising me, saying I seemed like a kind person. Then she pivoted to explaining how it was so financially burdensome to keep paying for driveway access. She talked about how my garage was just going to waste. I felt my face getting hot. "Listen," I said calmly. "I'm sorry you have to pay extra for parking, but my garage is not up for grabs. I only want to keep it for myself, especially now that I'm on my own. I knew I had no responsibility to her, but she looked so offended at my refusal you'd think I'd personally orchestrated her parking situation. She left with an annoyed huff, telling me this wasn't over. Over the next couple of weeks, I thought maybe she'd just cool off. I was wrong. Instead, she made it her mission to catch me whenever I came home, sometimes standing at the end of my driveway with her arms folded. Each time she'd say something like, "I've been thinking, and it really makes sense if you'd let me have the key. You barely park in there anyway." On days I kept my car in the driveway, she'd glare and mumble something about how I was wasting space. One afternoon, I saw her hunched over near my side fence. I was alarmed, so I peeked out the window. She was pacing in circles, occasionally craning her neck to look into my garage through a side window. I grew irritated, but also a little uneasy. That day, I decided to add a better lock, in case she got any wild ideas about letting herself in. It was an extra expense I didn't welcome, but the break-in paranoia was real enough for me to take steps. Meanwhile, I was still dealing with my own personal emotional roller coaster. The heartbreak of the separation from my husband lingered. I started therapy sessions, trying to cope with the loneliness and self-doubt that followed. Sometimes I'd spend hours lost in thought, remembering how once upon a time, we were excited about building a life in this exact house. In those moments, the last thing I needed was someone banging on my door, demanding something that never belonged to them. Right around this time, a second unexpected subplot emerged. The local homeowners association was investigating random property lines and issuing warnings for fences or hedges that exceeded regulations. I had a tall hedge near the back, which was apparently borderline too high. So in the midst of neighbor drama and emotional turmoil, I had to address the possibility of a citation for that hedge. It was ironically comedic that I was more concerned about the neighbor than about an official HOA letter, which told me how deeply her behavior was affecting me. Marisol started to escalate. She'd knock on my door late in the evening, claiming it was urgent. When I answered, she'd say something like, "I just have a few more reasons why you should give me the keys." She actually showed up once with a crudely typed list titled 10 Ways This Would Benefit Everyone. One point on her list read, "We can create a sense of community by sharing property." Another said, "You're less likely to need space for heavy items because your husband isn't here to help you lift them." I was appalled at her audacity and her assumption that I needed a partner for something as simple as moving a box. Each time I answered with a firm but straightforward no. She never asked about how I was coping emotionally. She never cared to ask if I needed help with anything. All she saw was an opportunity for cheap or free parking and decided she was entitled to it. Sometimes she tried to be cunning, leaving little notes in my mailbox with hearts drawn on them, accompanied by lines like, "I know we're both strong women, let's help each other." Then she'd sign it with a flourish of her name as if that sealed some cordial pact. I'll admit, part of me felt guilty. I had a few close friends who insisted I was absolutely in the right, and they told me not to question myself. But guilt has a funny way of sneaking in, especially when your emotional reserves are already depleted from heartbreak. A tiny voice inside me worried that maybe I was being too harsh. Maybe letting her pay some fee for partial use could be okay. But each time that thought arose, something told me it was a bad idea. My sense of personal boundaries and property rights wouldn't let me compromise. Plus, I was uneasy about the idea that she could come in at any time and rummage around. My close friend Danielle was supportive throughout this ordeal. She lived a short drive away, so I'd often invite her over for coffee. I vented about how invasive Marisol had become, and Danielle offered to help me change the locks again or even install a small security camera. I was initially unsure if it was worth it, yet the more I considered it, the more sense it made. I was no longer certain that Marisol wouldn't do something drastic. In the weeks that followed, I noticed a distinct shift in how Marisol interacted with me. She wasn't just pestering me anymore. She was borderline stalking me. She'd wait by the mailbox, watch for my car to pull in, and then step outside just to make a show of checking her phone. She'd make a point of sighing heavily when I parked in the driveway, as if that was a personal affront to her. Once, she shouted across the street, "You might as well leave it unlocked if you're just going to let it sit there." My neighbors, at least those who were around, looked on with raised eyebrows. I was mortified. One of those neighbors, Gabriel, who lived directly across the street, decided to get involved. One evening, as I was taking out my trash, he came over and casually asked what was going on with Marisol. He'd seen her ranting on the sidewalk a couple of times. I felt a bit embarrassed, but I recounted the story. how she demanded the keys to my garage, claimed I didn't need it because I was separated, and insisted that I let her store her car there. Gabriel listened sympathetically, nodding and shaking his head. He offered to walk over with me if she ever cornered me again, just to provide a sense of safety. Meanwhile, I was also juggling the HOA situation about my hedge. Because it was apparently blocking a certain line of sight to the sidewalk, the association wanted me to trim it down by a few inches. Nothing drastic, but it was another chore on my list. I ended up scheduling a landscaping crew to come out and do the job properly. The day they arrived, Marisol popped out of her house in a huff, complaining that she was trying to sleep. It was 9 in the morning. She shot dirty looks my way, muttering that if I had given her the garage keys, she wouldn't have to hear all this noise because she'd park there, not near the common driveway. The logic was baffling. Even the landscaping crew noticed her hostility. One of the workers jokingly said, "Wow, she's on a mission." I sighed and responded, "You have no idea." But that day, something snapped in me. I was done with her popping into every aspect of my life, making me feel unsafe in my own home. I decided it was time to up the ante and put a stop to her demands definitively. I did some research into local housing and property laws. I found out that, in my municipality, repeated harassment for access to someone else's locked property could constitute a civil matter, especially if it involved attempts to coerce or trespass. I wasn't planning on going to the police yet, but I wanted to be prepared if she ever tried to force her way in or threatened me further. I also learned that if she left anything inside my garage without permission, it would be considered an unauthorized storage situation, and I could legally have it removed. Armed with this information, I started documenting every interaction I had with Marisol. I kept a small notebook near my front door, noting times and dates of incidents, the nature of the conversation, and any witnesses. Gabriel agreed to provide a statement if it ever came to that, which reassured me. Danielle helped me install a small camera near the porch and another facing the garage entrance. It wasn't expensive or fancy, but it recorded enough to capture any suspicious activity. Marisol saw the cameras the weekend after they went up. She confronted me at my driveway edge, arms crossed, eyebrows raised. "You're going to this trouble to keep me out of a garage you don't need?" she spat. Anger oozed from her. I was both amused and mad. "Yes," I exhaled, "because it's my property. I can't trust you not to do something unauthorized." She scowled and left. The homeowner of Marisol's house, Richard, rarely came into town but responded to emails about the property. He seemed calm from my brief encounters with him. I wrote a brief message explaining how Marisol was harassing me for my garage, how I was uncomfortable, and how I wanted him to be aware of her behavior since she was his tenant. I simply informed him without demanding anything. He replied 3 days later with a brief, "I'm not surprised. I've complained before. I'll address it." That gave me hope, but I wasn't sure it would stop her. A new saga thread appeared on Q. Marisol discovered my contact with Richard. When I left for work one morning, she stepped in front of my car before I could back out of the driveway. I was jolted by her hand on my hood, forcing me to get out and talk. My heart raced. I lowered the window to hear her without letting her reach in. She snapped, "How dare you criticize me to Richard? You disgracing me. You have no right." That nearly dropped my jaw. I calmly replied, "You are threatening me on my property. I have the right to report that to your landlord if it's uncomfortable or harmful. Please move." She stood there for another tense moment before stalking away, cursing. I drove to work with trembling hands and a deep breath. She had crossed another line by blocking my car. I reached my limit that day. I asked a local attorney for advice. The attorney confirmed that I could seek a restraining order or file a police report for harassment or trespass if she continued to harass me or tried to force entry to the garage. To have a strong case if Marisol escalated, the attorney advised me to keep collecting evidence. New complications arose when my ex-husband Ethan reached out. He was in town briefly to finalize our separation legalities, mostly financial and bank account matters. We had to file paperwork to make me the sole owner of the house since it was originally in both of our names. Meeting at a local notary was agreed upon. Seeing him wasn't as painful as I expected, but it brought back memories. He politely asked how I was, and I tried not to tell him about Marisol. He shook his head sympathetically when I mentioned a neighbor's trouble. He felt bad that I was dealing with that alone, even though we were apart. Ethan sent me more documents to sign the next day while I worked. He added, "I hope you're not letting that neighbor bully you," in his email. "Remember, you've got every right to stand your ground." That little encouragement boosted me. That day, I vowed not to compromise with Marisol. The final showdown came quickly. I heard rummaging near my garage door one night. Through the window, Marisol was fiddling with something near the lock with a flashlight. My heart jumped into my throat. I immediately recorded on my phone and walked outside, making sure its camera was visible. Her explanation was laughable. She was checking to see if there was a gas leak coming from inside. The garage is sealed, and there was no smell or reason to suspect a gas leak. I told Marisol to leave the door. She snapped, "You can't keep me out of this forever," glaring at me. "You know not to need it." My temper flared. "This is my property," I grunted. "You're trespassing. Have you on video?" She tried to stay defiant as her eyes widened. She looked at my phone, realized I was serious, and backed off. Muttering curses, she left. The video was sent to Richard with the message, "Your tenant tried to break into my garage. If this continues, I'll call the police." He replied quickly, "I'll ask her to leave next month. This is unacceptable." He had enough complaints from other neighbors to end her tenancy. The next twist was when Marisol found an ally in Tasha, who confronted me at the mailbox for getting Marisol in trouble. Tasha chastised me for trying to get Marisol evicted. I stated, "She's trespassing and harassing me." Richard saw my evidence, and I warned him I would call the police. Evicting was his choice. She stomped away after calling me names under her breath. I laughed at someone so naive as to defend Marisol's behavior. In addition, the HOA informed me that they had reviewed the hedge after landscaping and that I was in compliance. At least that stress was gone. But the bigger stress persisted. Marisol might do something drastic before she had to leave, I worried. I kept my cameras rolling and avoided her unless necessary. Every time I left the house, I took pictures of the lock in case she tried another break-in. Marisol returned to my doorstep a week after Richard's email. She knocked loudly and jammed her foot between the door and frame when I opened it a crack, preventing me from closing it. My stomach flipped. She rants about how unfair it is that I ruin her life and make her lose her home. She said I caused her financial hardship and threatened to sue for emotional distress. My anxiety rose, but I persisted. "Remove your foot," I said softly, "or I will call the police now." Despite hesitation, she removed her foot. She lingered in the doorway, ranting about how she would make me pay for her eviction. My heart pounded so loudly I could hear it. I tried to stay steady while recording on my phone behind the door. I told her, "You have no one to blame but yourself." She screamed and stomped away, frustrated. I sent Richard and Danielle the latest footage that night. Danielle was horrified and advised me to call the police immediately. I was close, but she hadn't physically hurt me and had always backed down, so I didn't want to stir the pot. I probably should have called the police then, but I hoped it wouldn't. Richard fulfilled his promise. 2 weeks before the end of the month, he told me her lease wouldn't be renewed. Marisol continued to intimidate me by staring daggers at me when I came home and leaving notes on my door saying, "You're costing me everything or karma will come for you." I saved them because I needed all the evidence in case things got worse. Marisol took one last risk the day before her eviction. A loud bang followed screeching tires outside late at night. I ran to the window to see her car in my driveway, nearly hitting my house. Her car was dangerously close to the garage door with its front angled into the grass. The heart was in my throat. I immediately called the police's non-emergency line, saying my neighbor had driven onto my property and could cause damage. I watched Marisol get out of her car, run to the trunk, and gather boxes of personal items to stack next to my garage door while I was on the phone. I heard her shouting through my window that she was moving in after being kicked out of her old place. It was the last straw. I informed the dispatcher that she was trespassing, had a history of harassment, and feared property damage or a fight. Within 10 minutes, 2 police arrived. One approached me while the other handled Marisol. She made up a wild story about how I had rented the garage at the last minute, and she was just dropping off her stuff. I calmly produced the notes, video clips, and Richard's messages. The officer saw the boxes by my garage and asked Marisol if she had a signed agreement. She shouted that we had a verbal agreement, which I denied, citing the harassment. Richard confirmed over speakerphone that Marisol had no right to be on my property. The officer told her she was trespassing and would be arrested if she didn't leave my driveway immediately. She shouted at them that I was making her homeless and that she had nowhere else to go. Witnessing it was heartbreaking, but I had no sympathy. She violated every rule, harassed me, and tried to break into my garage. My safety and property rights came first. The police gave her one last warning. She was told to leave the neighborhood with her boxes. which they helped load into her car. Richard, her landlord, told her over the phone that she could no longer stay at his property. Marisol insulted me again as she got in her car, revved it, and drove down the street. One officer remained to file a report and asked if I wanted to press charges. He explained the process when I asked. I told him I'd think about it and get back to them because it was late and I was emotionally exhausted. I was relieved she was gone. Gabriel and a few neighbors told me that Marisol had tried to crash on various couches, but was rejected due to her nonsense over the next few days. She left the area altogether. Her attempt to bully me into giving up my garage resulted in eviction, a police encounter, and neighborhood scorn. I don't know what else she could get for that. I finally found peace afterward. My shoulders felt lighter as my garage remained locked and vacant. We celebrated with cheap sparkling juice with Danielle, relieved that the stressful saga was over. I reported the harassment a week later in case the officer returned. It was more precautionary. Her face was never seen again. I learned an unexpected self-assertiveness lesson throughout. Before this, my recent separation had me questioning my choices, worth, and strength. My heartbreak weakened me in ways I didn't realize. Standing firm against Marisol restored my confidence. It showed me that I can control my life and space and set and enforce boundaries. However, dealing with her strengthened relationships with neighbors like Gabriel, who praised my handling of the situation. He noticed some red flags with Marisol early on, but didn't know the extent. Another neighbor whispered that they were glad someone finally stood up to her because she was known to borrow things without asking or snoop around shared spaces. I guess I was the unlucky one she pushed around. Marisol's departure allowed me to focus on finalizing my divorce, transferring the house title, and taking therapy more seriously. I found joy again in small things like decorating a spare room, planting flowers near my front porch, and hosting small parties with friends. I considered getting a second cat to keep Pebbles company, especially on lonely nights when the house felt too big. The strangest part of this experience was seeing how entitled some people are. Marisol believed she was right. She thought my changed marital status meant I had no need for my property. She never realized that personal circumstances do not invalidate ownership of private property. The incident was bizarre and enlightening. This ordeal also improved my relationship with local police. I learned how to legally resolve such disputes, document evidence, and prevent trespassing. The attorney helped me understand criminal trespass versus civil harassment, which reassured me. It also taught me that not every dispute needs a lawsuit or a dramatic confrontation, though her intransigence nearly did. I reorganized some old boxes of holiday decorations and tools in my garage a month after her eviction. I realized that this space was mine and that I could do this without fear or interruption. Some old photo albums showed my ex-husband and me painting the garage walls a few summers ago. The photos evoked nostalgia, sadness, relief, and a strange sense of hope. Because after my ex and I split up, I protected this home from someone who tried to take advantage of my single status. Standing in my tidy garage, unmolested, symbolized my newfound independence. I had learned to set boundaries, so the garage was more than just storage. I felt lighter and more in control than in a while after closing the boxes. It was a turning point in my life, and I stopped letting others tell me what I needed. Community was one of the few positives from this disaster. Gabriel became a helpful and kind neighbor as I got to know him. Danielle frequently brought cookies or stopped by after work to chat. Some of the other residents, mostly acquaintances, realized they needed to look out for each other. We started a street-wide text to report suspicious activity and social events. Marisol's actions bonded us. The pain from my separation lingered, but standing up for myself gave me a newfound self-confidence. I started to see this house as a place where I could build new traditions, explore my identity, and possibly start over. The bizarre Marisol incident taught me I could protect my physical and emotional assets. A few months later, I heard that Marisol had rented a room and demanded extra privileges in another neighborhood. They were even less patient, so she moved again. I was sad she hadn't learned from her experience, but I was glad I resolved the issue so strongly. Manipulators and harassers often persist until someone stands firm. I smiled on a random Tuesday afternoon as I walked Pebbles in the backyard to get some sun. She's an indoor cat, but I let her walk on a leash sometimes. I felt safe and at peace in my own home. Just that felt good. I remembered dreading going outside if Marisol was around a few months earlier. My chest tightened every time I came home, worried she'd be on the front steps. Now tension was gone. The air felt lighter, and I could enjoy my home as intended. Some may wonder Marisol's final punishment or consequence. I believe she lost her home, damaged her neighborhood reputation, and received at least one police warning, not a minor outcome. The jail sentence was a direct result of her actions, though not dramatic. She fared worse than before. I kept what was mine and felt relieved and reaffirmed in my resilience. I occasionally look at the garage locks I added, remembering how I needed to protect that door from her prying eyes. I'm glad I made those decisions, even though it was annoying and expensive. It was better safe than sorry and a tangible reminder that I control my life. I wish her no harm, but I don't regret making her pay for her actions. I find it strange that a garage can cause a storm. I suppose that's life. We never know what people feel entitled to or how far they'll go to get it. I just wanted a quiet life to rebuild after a painful breakup. Personal boundaries and real-world property disputes were my crash course. I learned how to set up cameras, document evidence, and stand firm in the face of outrageous entitlement. The lesson from all of this is that one should never give up their rights or possessions because someone else says they're unused or unnecessary. Ownership is about respecting boundaries. Do not be afraid to say, "No, this is mine and I have every right to keep it." Protecting your peace of mind is not shameful. Finally, I did that, and I'm so glad I didn't cave. Right now, I'm fine. I'm rebuilding my life gradually. With memories everywhere, this house can be lonely. My house, though, learning to fill it with new memories, people, and experiences. And my garage? Still locked and full of my stuff alone. It may seem trivial, but it symbolizes my refusal to let anyone cross my boundaries again. Friends, thank you. See you soon.